to the curve, where ideas take flight. Blending tech.
All right, welcome to The Learning Curve. My name is Carl Mohn. I'm a digital learning specialist here at Region 7.
I'm Benjamin Wood. I'm coordinator of digital learning here at Region 7.
And today what we want to talk to you about as we kind of dive a little bit deeper into some of the pedagogy, into some of the best practices of education, is how can we create learner-centered classrooms? And that is really almost a buzzword kind of a thing, and we recognize that here in Texas that shows up on our evaluation system in TTESS. And so we know that learner-centered classrooms is at least the way that the state wants us to go, and perhaps our administration wants us to go. But what really is learner-centered classrooms? What do you think?
So I think you're totally right. I think you're seeing this really rise to the surface in some terminology that we've heard. When I hear student-centered classrooms or learner-centered classrooms, it takes me back to my traditional education experience. And there were plenty of classrooms that I experienced that had wonderful, great teachers that did phenomenal jobs. And then there were plenty of times where I would say that it was not a learner classroom. The focus was not on me and what I was doing in the class, but what I was required to hear on there. And so when you think about learner-centered classrooms, I think the way that the class is laid out has something to do with it. Yeah. And so whenever I hear those, I'm constantly thinking about what does that classroom look like? Mm-hmm. How is it laid out? And those kind of things.
I think that's a really important idea to touch on too, because when we're talking about shifting from teacher-centered really to learner-centered, it's kind of a huge paradigm shift, and all of it is involved, which makes it kind of a difficult challenge when we think about that. The other thing that comes up when we're trying to think about a learner-centered classroom is who's the point? What's the point, right? So if we're talking about learner-centered, then we're obviously moving away from teacher-centered or educator-centered. And one of the things that we like to throw out, one of the things that we talk about in our sessions here at the Service Center and even when we're in districts, is when we think about learning, what's the point? Who is the point, right? Who is it for? Who's the classroom for? Who is education for? And the answer always comes back. It's for the students. It's for the learners. And so kind of where we want to go with the conversation today is if we're shifting to a learner-centered classroom, if we're trying to think about learning as the goal of education, then the focus has to be on the student. It has to be on the learner and not on me as the teacher.
And I think I had a superintendent explain it really well one time. He used this analogy that education, if it were seen as a traditional business, what would our product be?
Yeah.
Well, our students are the product. Yeah. Everything that we do is to build that student, to build that product, to start off with what they are and build them into a better version of themselves, a more knowledgeable version of themselves, and all those things. And so if we focus and think of them as, well, the students are our product, then we need to focus everything we do with that, and that's where student-centered classrooms come into play.
Yeah. So we want to kind of address as we talk about this idea. First of all, we want to address some of the challenges, and then maybe toward the end of the episode talk about some of the practical ways that we really can maybe level up or at least change the focus of our classrooms along the way. So one of the things that I was always struck by when trying to create learner-centered experiences for my classroom was how much time it took. And here was the other thing. When I'm trying to create an experience for my students, it's important that my students are in the room and they get called out for whatever. Maybe they got called to the office, or maybe they're gone on a school-sponsored trip or something like that, which is wonderful. That's great. But when they're not in my room, it's difficult for me to have those kinds of experiences with them. The other things that take place are some of those administrative tasks that just get in the way, whether it's, and not that they're not essential,
like
because they are.
Fire drill, essential.
Absolutely essential,
but can derail a class. On there
really quickly. And most of the time, most of our schools work to put those at the very end of class or something like that, and they, because they realize that it's difficult to get a class back from a drill or something like that. But these kinds of things, and I referenced this in the notes, and I feel like it's important to say, so I want to talk about it a little bit. These kind of things become what's been called the tyranny of the urgent. Things that are happening right now, maybe they're not the most important things in the world. They're certainly essential and we need to do them, but maybe they get in the way of the learning a little bit, or what's also been called the theory of the whirlwind, things that kind of get caught up, and if we're not cautious, if we're not careful, our classroom gets derailed by some of these tasks or by some of these events that are really difficult to control. And so when we think about this, part of this is going to come down to how are we managing the classroom, how are we managing the time, how are we spending the time perhaps beforehand to consider all of the possible disruptions while we're designing these experiences, learning experiences, and which really has some. And we were talking about some management protocols, maybe even in outside of school that might help us develop a better sense of how to work through this.
You kind of talked about this just a little bit, but you talked a lot about examples of outside the classroom. But I think we have a myriad of examples of the tyranny of the urgent inside the classroom too.
Yeah.
How many times have we started a lesson and the internet's gone down? How many times have we started a lesson and the power went out? How many times have we had all these things in line to go exactly the way we expect, and then something for some reason outside of our direct control happens? On there, and I think a lot of the conversation that we're probably going to have if we take a step back and always think about, is this happening to me or am I happening to it? Also can put this in a way that we view some of these things. Some of the things you mentioned, like outside of business, there's some models that we'll kind of go through that we can kind of glean some knowledge and understanding from as we go through.
Yeah. So before we jump in, this really isn't an episode about time management. But we've got to address it. Sometimes there's a really practical aspect to addressing these things before we get into the learning experiences, and it's that whole idea that the better we're prepared, the less likely it is that something's going to derail us along the way. And I'll also say this about learner-centered classrooms: the better culture that we've developed in the class, the better exchange and interaction that we can have with our students leading up to this, the less likely that we're going to be derailed no matter what happens.
And I think something like that, when you bring up class culture, that's something that you have to start from day one. You have to build in and incorporate. That is not something that's just organically going to happen. And for the longest time, I as an educator thought, okay, well, this will just organically happen. And I've realized over the course of my career, if I wanted any positive impact on in a class culture, I had to embed that in some way. I had to build into that because, again, our students are young learning adults that don't necessarily know how to build that innately, and so we have to build that framework. And the benefit of that is you have a positive culture that will lead into the instances that you have to pivot. You've now got that culture that will help ride through on there.
Absolutely. And I think that's essential to think about, is that we recognize that things are going to happen. They just will. And so the better prepared we are to pivot, the better prepared we are to deal with whatever the distraction is, the more likely we are to create a learner-centered classroom.
Well, and I'll pick up my wife for a second as an example. I'm not one to use an umbrella often. I would like to claim that it's because I'm a stoic. And
I've noticed that about you.
Yes, yeah. And it's the stoic about it that outside external effects or factors that I can't affect, I'll just deal with. But I've also understood too, it's also lack of preparation. My wife carries an umbrella in every car that we have because she knows one day it will rain. I think every individual day I rain, unless I've looked at the weather, I don't necessarily expect it to rain. And so when it does, I pay the cost of, I didn't plan for that. So I have to deal with the external influence and stuff. Yeah. So I think what you talk about, preparation, really matters, and we'll kind of get into that. Again, not time management necessarily, but I think there are some benefits of pre-planning things for when the tyranny of the urgency shows up.
Yeah. So let's kind of look at that a little bit. Let's talk about the planning that comes in. Let's talk about the preparation that takes place, because and we've mentioned this before. We're both secondary teachers. BJ, you came out of the CTE world, which is I'm a little jealous because there's a lot of practical, hands-on kinds of things just normally and naturally in that world. Whereas I come out of the humanities, and it's sometimes a little more abstract in how we approach things. So from my vantage point, and as a history, social studies teacher, the typical thing that you see, particularly in secondary classrooms or in higher education, is a professor lecturing to their students and posing series of questions and giving all sorts of and information, and then a student's just regurgitating that back on a test. Not a very learner-centered way to approach education. It's a traditional way to think about it, and I most often run into people who are like that, who are social studies people, or history people, or perhaps English people or something, but out of the humanities. And so it's a shift for us to think about, how can I take some of these, and to be very fair, some of these really high concepts, it's difficult to have hands-on experience with them, that you sometimes just have to explain them. You have to talk about them. You've got to have some back and forth conversation. So sometimes it's hard to make those hands-on. And so we have to shift our point of view a little bit to start thinking, how can I take something that's very high concept? I'm a U.S. history person, so how can I take something as high concept as themes coming out of the Enlightenment? And how can I practically tie that to the American Revolution, which the American Revolution absolutely came out of, or developed out of, some of the thoughts that these revolutionaries had came from some of these French philosophers in the Enlightenment, which can be really, today we're going to talk about Descartes or John Locke, and your students just roll their eyes and like, all right, we're going to have to hear some more philosophy or something like that. But that practically worked itself out into colonists throwing tea into the harbor and rebelling, and how do we make those connections to hands-on without handing weapons to our students and say, go overthrow the school? That's a practical way to approach that. Maybe not the best way to think about it. But that's where we're realistically, that's what we've got to do, is we've got to take sometimes really high concepts and make them into very hands-on practical.
Which, again, they're not going to overthrow the school, but I mean, I always enjoyed that time of year that was being covered, because you saw the most number of petitions come out from the student body and anything, and you knew they were studying that. But yeah,
I might have been the author of some of those. Not the author, but supporter of some of those petitions.
No, but I think you're right. I think having those high concepts. The hard thing with that is, I think we as teachers sometimes fall into this vein of, well, it's so complex my students won't grasp it. And I have to either chunk it, I have to break it down, and I have to lecture and walk them through and hold their hand through that process on there to get them to that high level thought. I think sometimes we do a disservice unintentionally from our students. The problem becomes, though, anytime you're doing student-centered, that takes a lot of front work, a lot of front loading, and a lot of trust. Because I've had the experience, and I'm sure you have, when you give that control to your students and you say, hey, we are starting at point A and I need you to get to point Z, and I'm going to give you some freedom in between there, the ways that they go to and the conclusions that they draw may not always perfectly align with the viewpoint, or not viewpoint, but might not align perfectly with what that overriding concept is. And so how do you handle allowing them to have some room to wiggle, some room to get involved in the process of learning, and still get them to the point you need them to?
And that's a good question too, because that really is, even people who want to jump in and say, yes, I get this, I understand this, they draw that exact conclusion. It's right. The standards say, I've got to get them here. I've got to get them to this point. And what happens if they don't get there? Right? I've seen the test. What happens if they don't get to that conclusion? And so there are a couple of ways to manage that, I think. And I'm a project-based learning guy, and so that's really the only way that I like to teach. It's asking kind of relevant questions, driving questions, authentic questions, and letting my students explore. But what we have to do in the meantime, in order to make sure that they get from point A to point Z, is we set benchmarks along the way. And because we would do projects that were 3, 4, 5 weeks long. And so if we get to the end of 5 weeks and all of a sudden we discover that our students don't know what it is that they need to know, then we have then also done a disservice to our students, because they didn't get where they needed to be. And so what we've got to do, and this is kind of one of the ways that I think about things, especially when you're thinking about planning, because you're absolutely right. If you don't spend the time planning on the front end, you're never going to, your students are never going to get what they need to know. It's where are we setting those benchmarks along the way? Where am I checking? Where am I using good formative assessment strategy? Where am I using good Socratic seminar or some kind of a didactic reasoning where we're able to actually converse and talk about things? Where am I placing those things so that I can evaluate where they are and know where I need to make corrections along the way? Really great case point in here. We had a group one time, this was in my geography class, had a group one time, and we were doing, it wasn't a super long session or unit, it might have been a week or something like that. And there's this group of boys, and they were good. They were just good kids. We could trust them. They weren't gonna run off and paint themselves and Lord of the Flies kind of stuff. I mean, we knew that they were gonna get their work done. Consequently, I didn't pay a lot of attention to them while they were working because I was working with people who I knew needed perhaps needed my help a little bit more. The end result of that was they misunderstood a question that we had asked in one of the projects, and when they got up to present, nothing that they said was right. I mean, like zero. None of it was correct. And
well, so and again, just as an example, so you experience the tyranny of the urgent.
Yeah.
The other needs within the classroom.
Yeah.
On that, right?
That's exactly right. Oh, and that's a great way to bring that back in, because that's exactly what happened. I was focused on students who, in my opinion, needed my attention to make sure that they got to where they needed to be. And because of that, I neglected a group of kids who I was like, oh, they're fine. They're going to do a great job. Completely missed the assignment, completely misunderstood what we were talking about. They worked hard. Like, you could see the work that they had put into it, and they were really confident when they were up there presenting, and I'm sitting there going, oh, that's not even close to right. And then it's like, oh, and how do you, because you didn't want to reprimand them because they'd done good work, they just gotten everything wrong. And so I took that as a lesson to myself to make sure that as I'm planning to put in scheduled pit stops almost where I check in with my kids so that they understand the concept. Yeah.
And that brings up a good point. So one thing that we talked about a lot, or I was in one of the things that I was studying a long time ago when I was doing project management, is the Eisenhower matrix. And so the Eisenhower matrix is a just think of four squares. We'll have it on the screen on there. And so what it has on the left side of there is you have a box down below that's not important. You have a box that's important, and then on top you have a box that is urgent, and then a box that is not urgent. And depending on where those break out, that tells you which actions you should do or not.
Yeah.
And so in this case, and again, every teacher's gone through something similar like that. I can tell my students would work on projects as well, and it would be some core competency that they would need for a certification test of some sort on there. And it's heartbreaking to see them spend that much time to make something that missed the mark, and having to correct that and do that. But I think there's a learning experience with that. But what's so hard for us as teacher is, if you look at the Eisenhower matrix, almost everything we have to deal with is either extremely important or extremely urgent.
Right.
We rarely have not urgent, not important,
right,
because we're dealing with students. We have a finite amount of time with them. We are the single most largest indicator of success in the classroom is our experience, or is our interaction with the kids. So I would say that what we do is highly important. The problem that we run into is, how do we balance what is not urgent but important versus what is urgent but not important? And that's the struggle. And again, I didn't perfect this. Like I even to this day as a veteran teacher and having good results with my students and them going to do great things, I wasn't always great at balancing out and choosing in that instant what is most important. And I think that's where, just like you say, developing systems so that you have internal checks throughout the process really helps to ensure that while the end goal is important, it may not be urgent and pressing. That helps you do some validation checks as I go through on there.
Yeah. So let's kind of shift the conversation a little bit, because there's something else that happens in learner-centered classrooms. When your students are really engaged, and let's go best case scenario, perfect day, everybody is just firing, they're going, it's awesome, right? The classroom is buzzing, people are moving around, they're having really great conversations. it looks different than a teacher-centered classroom looks. And for those of us who grew up in our generation and older, when you think about school, you think about desks and rows, you think about the teacher is speaking, and you think about I'm not speaking, right? I am writing notes, or even if I'm not writing notes, even if I'm not super engaged, I'm at least quiet. And a true learner-centered classroom, a project-based classroom, when you're doing group work, when you're doing collaboration, or when you're studying or working or something like that, there is noise. People tend to be, I know my students, they were up and they were moving around, they were going over here to get this thing so they could put that together and build this, or they're going over there to talk to somebody, and not that they were it's not, they weren't doing anything wrong, right? They were up, they were moving around,
They're
and that was
showcasing autonomy and
absolutely
agency,
which is exactly what we want, right? It's difficult to move from a teacher-centered classroom to a learner-centered classroom for the teacher, because I have to become much more tolerant with noise. But the other side of that is when administrators are looking in a classroom and it's louder perhaps than what we're all used to, and that's not saying anything against anybody. It's just we all have to get used to. It looks different, and student engagement looks different maybe than what we're used to and what we like. And
and it's human nature to teach the way you were taught.
Absolutely.
And the majority of us, and all of us really, when we first got into education, we had just come out of university, college, university. And colleges are great at making future professors. They are, in a large part, especially in the humanities, especially in education, especially on these things, they are lecturers at heart. I mean, that really is the model. And the very classrooms that we set in college were lecture-style classrooms, with very few exceptions in my experience. Now, there is some really good progress being made with that, and I think that'll benefit us. But when you first get into the classroom, if you think as your first year teacher, you're thinking, okay, I'm going to model the teachers that I had in college, or I'm going to model the teachers I had in high school. And the classroom that is student-centered is going to look drastically different, just like you highlighted, than what we experienced going through higher education and all those things. And we have to make sure and kind of disconnect from that there if we're going to pursue student learning classrooms. On there. Now, with that sound, with that noise, what's the first impression of a teacher that hasn't seen a student-centered classroom? Typically.
And I've got a great example for you. So I got to teach with a partner, and which was wonderful, and I loved having a team. And she came out of, and she had been a veteran before we met, and so she had more experience than I had in the classroom. But she had come out of, when she'd come out of a classroom, gone into administration, and she's coming back to the classroom, her paradigm was kids are sitting, they're quiet, they're doing their work, and there you go. And it was funny because we would have these conversations where she would look at me and she'd be like, is it too loud? Is the classroom too loud? And I'd be like, nah, I think it's okay. I think we're all right. Because I could tolerate more noise than she could at that point in time. And, and full disclosure, I was an alt-cert person, so I didn't go through all of the education courses that a lot of people go through. And so I was just like, it's fine, we're good. And then she would ask me, is it too loud? And I'd be like, yeah, it's too loud now. And so it takes a little while to develop a tolerance almost to the noise, to the activity. And that's the other thing that we have to learn how to be more comfortable with is the activity that's going on. And but that comes back to that culture question, because if I've developed a positive and a dynamic classroom culture, then I can trust my students to be on task. And even when they're not always on task, I can trust that they'll get back on task. Because
they become self-policing.
Yes.
If they're working in groups over something, if they're reliant on one another, if they're exhibiting autonomy in what they do, they will self-police, and I think that's a great thing. One thing you said that just always reminds me, we've got to make sure that we never equate silence equals understanding.
Right.
And that's so often, especially in lecture experiences, well, if my students are quiet and they're writing down what I'm saying, then they're understanding and knowledgeable about what I'm talking about, and that doesn't correlate at all. But we make that assumption sometimes, and to the detriment of
sadly we do,
students.
Because often it's the students who are the most quiet who understand the least because they don't want to ask the question. So we've got to be able to.
In your example too, I think that brings up the point of control. You know, it's very, very easy for a new teacher to feel like in order to have control over the class, they control all the variables, and you can't control it.
That's exactly right.
And sound, volume, movement around the class, all these kind of things are control mechanism, and they are needed, and understandably so. And please understand, we are not saying you shouldn't have control in your class.
Right.
We have tons of great things and workshops over classroom management using digital tools and all these other things.
And procedures are always
procedures,
important.
yes.
Absolutely.
That builds into that culture.
Yes.
But the more student-centered classroom we have, the less direct control we need as teachers.
Right.
Because if you've built that dynamic culture that you're talking about, if you've built trust in there, your students are going to be okay with less direct control.
Yep.
There's still indirect control. There's still indirect lines and boundaries and all the things we've set, but that inherent transition of control, I guess I'll say, provides the flexibility necessary to have a student-centered classroom. I would
And I think that's very well said. I agree completely with that. So far we've been really talking about kind of a philosophical approach to learner-centered classrooms, and we talking about time management, or talking about preparation, or talking about what it looks or sounds or feels like, all of those things. But we've not really addressed the practical aspect of how do we really develop learner-centered classrooms. There are some wonderful tools that you can use. There's some AI tools that you can use for planning that will give you some, especially if this is new to you, if you've never done learner-centered classrooms before. There's some great planning tools out there that can help you write lesson plans, or help you write unit plans that are more learner-centered, or bring in activities that are learner-centered. But how do we evaluate whether a program truly can lead to student-centered learning, or if it's even a good tool to use? How do we evaluate those things? How do we measure those things?
So there's a couple things. There's several models out there. For a long time, SAMR was a way that you could do that. But what we found, the SAMR model, and there's a picture on our screen here, walks you through several ways to evaluate whether or not a piece of software or a technique is valuable. The problem, though, is it becomes overly cumbersome to deal with. It's very hard to have discussions about this because of the way that the model was set up and the wording that it had. One model that we've really enjoyed and we really have seen the benefit of this is the pager model.
Yeah.
So the pager model is a hierarchical model. It's built similar to, say, like Bloom's taxonomy or things like that, if you're familiar with, on there. And it gives you a mechanism, a framework, a set of rules and words that will help in the discussion and understanding of what's happening in the classroom. And it really focuses, its end goal is to get people to a student-centered classroom on there. And so there are several levels. So it starts off at the platform level, and then it has activities, then it has generate, then it has engage, and then it has real world on there. And each one of those steps does distinct things on there. In the pager model, the whole idea is that you can look at activities, events, things that you're already doing, and evaluate, well, where are they currently? Is it teacher-centered? Is it student-centered? And using that framework, you can take that same event, same lesson, same module, whatever you may be doing, and raise it to the level of student-centered by making adjustments and tweaks with that. And so it provides that framework. What's great about Pager is also locally developed in the East Texas area, and it actually came out of a source of frustration. So Daniel Rich over at Sabine ISD developed this out of, again, a source of frustration, and we're looking forward to being able to talk with him and speak with him and get his view on Pager and as we go more in depth with this. But Pager is a great model for student-centeredness. Again, it just focuses on ultimately who is doing the work.
Right.
If you're going into a classroom and the teacher is doing 90% of the work, and the students are doing 10%, then that is a teacher-centered classroom, and it's honestly probably not going to be very effective.
Yeah.
You'll probably see that in scores at the end of the year. You'll probably see that in frustrations and referrals and all these things. If you go into a classroom and 90% of the work is being done by the students, they have dynamic culture, they have autonomy, they have agency built in and baked in, you're going to see that in the test results.
Yeah.
Those score, the same students that would have been in a teacher-centered classroom are going to score higher simply because they enjoy the work more. typically, not always, but typically what I would see is the more referrals you have, the less enjoyment the students are having in the classroom. On there, because as humans, we are just innately wired for curiosity. And what drives learning more than curiosity?
Absolutely.
And if we can spark that curiosity in our students, if we can get them to self-teach, if we can get them to be part of the learning process, then they're going to have so much more enjoyable time in the classroom. They're going to do better, and they're going to cause less problems.
Yep.
It's just ultimately what boils down to. So Pager is a great model for that. What are some other things?
Yeah, well, and so really when you think about how are you evaluating your practices, how are you evaluating the tools that you're using, how are you approaching the learning situation? Because and I love that you brought up who's doing the most work, because this isn't new, and that's the thing. None of this is new. This is really, really old stuff. John Dewey's talking about things like this 120 years ago. I remember my wife, when she was in education classes, she had to read a book called The First Days of School, which I had to read when I did my certification as well, the Harry Wong. And they're talking about the same thing, that whoever's doing the most work is the one who's doing the most learning. And so, and I love the little thing that you talk about where we want our students to be the ones dragging out of the building at the end of the day because they've done the most work, whereas we, all right, we're just kind of skipping to our part. Yeah, absolutely.
Right. For the longest time, I've got to be very, very open and honest, candid. For the first time I heard a teacher being called a facilitator, I felt a little disrespected.
Yeah.
I thought, this is demeaning. I don't want to be a facilitator. I want to be the person that has all the knowledge. Yeah. And I bring it down from the mountain to my students. And it took me several years of experiencing what a student-centered classroom is to really embrace and understand what that meant. And now, I love the idea of being a facilitator. I think that's the highest praise I can give a person in there, because ultimately our whole goal is to make empowered students that will follow and build their own understanding of learning, and that internal drive will drive them to better experiences. And student-centered classrooms can do that, and that's the great thing. So as we talk about this, as we talk about being a facilitator, I think that's one of the greatest compliments you can give someone. And they're probably not as tired at the end of the day either.
You know what? And it's funny that you say that, because when we first leaned into this, after the first few weeks, because it does take a lot of work at the front. It takes a tremendous amount of work to plan all the stuff. But I started to feel a little bit guilty that I wasn't doing enough, and it would be like, oh, all right. I'm just answering questions. And it was amazing. The first day that we showed up and our students came in and they just started working, and we didn't give them any directions. They just came in and started working, and
you built the system.
Yeah, and we just kind of looked at each other and we were like, "Do we say anything?" And we're like, "No, don't wreck it," because we want them to keep working. And I remember the first time I was offended a little bit is when I had a student tell me, "You didn't teach us anything." And I was like, well, wait, and then I stopped and I paused and I was like, yeah, you're right, I didn't. Or, you're not teaching me. And then I kind of leaned into that a little bit, and I was like, that's not my job. My job isn't to teach you anything. My job is to expose you to information and to help you work your way through it so that you make the connections. And which is bizarrely, when you look at connectivism, that's exactly what learning is. It's that our students are making connections. They're the ones who are connecting prior learning to new learning, which shows up in the TEKS. Have you connected? And it shows up in our lesson planning, and it's connecting this learning to that past learning. When they are the ones who are exposed to the information, they're asked relevant questions about it, and they're asked to do something with it, to make something, whether it's practical, let me learn this task or this skill or whatever, or whether it's abstract, but I can speak about it, or I can make a video about it, or I can write a song about it or something like that. When they're the ones who are asked to do something with the information, they're the ones who are making the connections. And that magically is where the learning takes place. And so when and I'm going to go real quickly back to the test scores, because what you see, the reason that they have better test scores, certainly because they're engaged in the learning and they're excited about the learning, but what this does is it helps them become critical thinkers and problem solvers. And if our students can become critical thinkers, and if they can learn how to be problem solvers, they're going to succeed on whatever it is. And whether they remember geography isn't the point. It's how did they come out of my class? Did they come out of my class as good students? Did they come out of my class as curious learners, as lifelong? Because if we can manage that, then I think that's the win.
So you just mentioned there the idea of going to student-centered work brings in more work on the front
Yeah,
end.
absolutely.
And I agree with that. That was the experience I had. The benefit was that I got some of that time back on the back end,
Yeah.
and I was able to spend more time with my students, interacting with them in there. Can you talk about a little bit with the advent of AI and what that's done? Because I find myself every day that we experience a different new AI tool or technique, I always have that brief moment of, if I had just had this in the classroom, how much a better of a teacher would I have been? How much faster of a teacher would I have been? Can you kind of elaborate a little bit?
Well, and that exactly, the more things that I find in AI and the more tools, I just find myself jealous.
Yeah.
Like, oh, if only, if I had just had this. Because what we found, and to back up just a little bit, what we discovered is, yes, the very first time we did it, tremendous amount of work. In subsequent years, the work got less and less and less because we'd already done it.
Right.
We'd already done most of the work. And all we had to do was tweak. And all we had to, and we were constantly, we never did the exact same thing, but we would use that as a jumping off point.
It became a refinement.
Yes, it did. And so for me, the AI isn't necessarily let's create the whole thing, although it actually is pretty powerful at helping come up with new ideas, which I could definitely see sometimes tossing whole projects and go, all right, let's kind of try to do this new again with AI. But what I love about it, and what's so great about AI, is it speeds up the process. Where I'm still the one who's having to come up with, all right, or my curriculum. Oh, well, we've got to do this, right? Here are the standards. We've got to do the standards. We've got to follow this. So it's not that I'm not doing the work. It's that I'm using the tool to make me better, to make me more efficient, to help me come up with new ideas. And even teachers that we were talking to in our workshops are like, just help. I would have never thought of that idea. And that's exactly what it is because of how the tools are working. It speeds up that process. The other thing that I like about it is it leans into best practices. If I tell it to, it leans into those best practices already and helps me. So for project-based learning, helps me discover what's a good quality driving question, or what are good context questions that I can ask my students, that I can lead them. Sometimes authenticity is difficult because how do you take abstract concepts and make them authentic to the learner? So having the AI help me develop authentic projects, or maybe work that would go to an authentic audience, a relevant audience, and it's taking things like that, and it's just a step change in what I was able to do in my own limited imagination, trying to develop these projects or ask these questions. And so AI, what's brilliant about some of these AI tools is they help us create plans, they help us find engaging activities, and maybe that's it. I need a hook. I need something that's going to just make this real for my students. And the AI can just go so much faster that it's not as daunting a task now to go, man, I've got to, we were begging for planning time at the beginning of the year because we just knew it was going to take tremendous amount of time to write these ridiculously long units. I would still beg for the time now, but I think I could be more effective.
But AI makes that heavy lift
Absolutely.
into just a lift. I
Yeah.
mean, it is still work.
It's still a lift.
Thing you have to do.
But it's not nearly as heavy as it would be. Yeah.
I think too, also that thought partner. I know we've talked about it
Yeah.
before, but just going through this process, because again, most times if you're going from a teacher-centered classroom to a student-centered classroom, it's going to feel uncomfortable.
Yeah.
It's not going to be easy. It's going to feel like, what am I doing at first? And
Absolutely.
having a thought partner along the process, if you don't have a mentor teacher that's done it, or somebody at your campus that is in the process of doing that, I feel like can really help with that that lift of transitioning over to a student-centered classroom.
And just shameless plug, another aside here.
Yeah.
As a blended learning person, AI is wonderful for helping develop blended learning lessons, blended learning units, and I think it can really bring in again, where we're going is student autonomy and agency. And when our students can become their own agents of learning, it just brings back that curiosity, because we're naturally curious people, and I'm afraid sometimes we educate the curiosity out of our kids. and I think that's tragic. And so if we can bring a little bit of that back, then I think that we can capture their imaginations and really help them become even more creative people. So,
along with test scores, if we go back to the T-TESS, if we want to move to the left, if we want to become proficient, if we want to become higher levels on our T-TESS, the more we lean into student-centered, the more we'll be there. Because if you look at the wording from one area to the next, the wording leans more and more onto the students are doing. The students are doing work. They're involved in the process more and more on there. So I think that's just so impactful and so important to remember on there. And again, we want to make good lifelong learners, and the net benefit of that is higher T-TESS scores, higher STAR scores. And that's great. And that's not the end goal, although it is, but it's not the direct end goal. That's the benefit that we get from student-centered classrooms.
That's exactly right. So we know that this has been kind of a philosophical sort of a discussion, sort of high level almost as you're thinking about that. We would love to work practically with you. We would love to help you write lessons. I mean, seriously, these are things that we would like to do. We would love to come work with you in PLCs or even one-on-one. We're happy to do that. Reach out to us, please. Help. Let us serve you. Let us be a part of the work that you're doing, because we know that you're doing great work, and we just want to be a part of what good things are going on in Region 7. So,
definitely.
All right. Well, thanks so much for listening today, and we hope you have a great week. And like I said, reach out if we can ever do anything to support you.
Welcome to the curve, where ideas take flight. Blending tech and teaching, sparking insight. From digital tips to stories untold, we're here to inspire, to break,